Great. Okay, welcome everyone to another Friday seminar at PSU. I'm Kelly Clifton, a faculty member in civil engineering. I can tell we're competing with the weather outside, so hopefully there's a bunch of you out there on the internet. Today we have Dr. Jennifer Dill, who is a professor of urban studies and planning. She's also the director of the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, or OTRAC at PSU. She's going to talk to us today about different types of cyclists. So look forward to that, and take it away.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I haven't been here on a Friday in a little while, but it's good to be here and talk about my research. So what I'm going to talk about is the 4 types of cyclists. What do we know? How can it help? So before I go any further, how many of you have heard of this 4 types of cyclists? Yeah, it's pretty, and that's partly the motivation for doing this work. So where this came from, the city of Portland, Roger Geller in particular, he's the city of Portland's bicycle coordinator, developed this typology over the years, and there's a good document on the City of Portland website where he's written describing the typology. And he came up with this typology of the 4 types, and they're labeled strong and fearless, enthused and confident, interested but concerned, and no way, no how. And this has been a typology that the City of Portland has been using in its bicycle master plan and in a lot of their bicycle policy and planning efforts. Roger, through various sources of data and discussions, and came up with an estimate of how many Portlanders fit into each of these categories. And he hypothesized that about 60% of the population might fit into that interested but concerned category, and that is sort of the target market for how, if we're going to increase cycling significantly in this city, we got to get the interested but concerned to bicycle more. This typology has resonated a lot, both within the city of Portland and well beyond. We looked through, Nathan McNeil, who's a researcher here at PSU, and I sort of combed through other plans and documents from throughout the country and beyond, and found numerous other cities and states, etc., bicycle planning documents that used this same typology. And so it's really caught on. When I go to national conferences, a lot of people know about this, they use it, etc. What I wanted to do with this research was, in part, to validate these 4 types. Because while Roger used a lot of different sources and discussions, and this has evolved over time, the numbers that he has attached to the 4 groups is really just an estimate. It's not as if he went and did a study to figure out exactly, what share of the population falls into each of these categories. And so one objective was to validate these 4 types, or develop an alternative if these 4 types don't seem to be working. And then once we categorize cyclists in some way, can we use that to figure out how do we get more people cycling? Sort of a market analysis type thing. The project was funded by OTRAC and the City of Portland. And I want to acknowledge again Nathan McNeil, who worked on this project with me from start to finish. It's not finished yet, but there's more. First of all, we have to go back to Roger's sort of definitions of these categories and understand them a bit more. So combing through his document where he's laid out some of the key things that I looked at to try to define these groups. On the strong and fearless, These are people who will ride in Portland regardless of roadway conditions. So in general, the typology is based upon people's comfort level and the types of facilities that they will or will not ride on. The other thing I need to make clear is this typology was intended to describe the adult population as a whole, not just people who currently bicycle. So it's ideas we want to somehow, all adults in Portland should fit into one of these categories. So the enthused and confident, which is the next group, some of the quotes from Roger's description. They're comfortable sharing the roadway with automotive traffic, but they prefer to do so operating in their own facilities. They appreciate bike lanes and bike boulevards. They're attracted to cycling in Portland by its network and supporting infrastructure. And he also thought that perhaps 60% of this group might currently ride regularly for transportation. Then we go on to the interested but concerned. So these are folks they're curious about cycling. They like riding a bicycle, but they're afraid to ride. And he asserted that very few of these people regularly ride bicycles. And then you have the no way, no how. These are people who are not interested for a number of reasons, whether it be topography, inability, or just no interest whatsoever. And he does make it clear that the separation between these four broad groups is not generally clear-cut. There could be a lot of blurring between the categories. So taking these sort of carefully dissecting how he has defined these four types, I set out to validate it in some way. So what we did is we did a random phone survey of just over 900 adults in the Portland metropolitan area. So not just the city of Portland, but we included the entire metro region on the Oregon side. We did not include Vancouver, Washington. So we have all the way, Hillsborough, Beaverton, Gresham, Wilsonville, etc., within the urban growth boundary, basically. The sample included both landline and mobile phone numbers because increasingly a lot of people, particularly younger people, do not have a landline, and that's posing a lot of problems in doing phone research. So we did sample mobile phone numbers as well to try to make sure that we reached that demographic. The surveys themselves happened in July and August of 2011. I have some response rate numbers there. Phone survey response rates are calculated in a variety of sort of standardized ways. There's two ways to do it. I've presented them both there. I do have a document that goes into more of those details if you want to comb through that. And then the other thing, even though we did include mobile phone numbers, there's still some bias in any sampling like this. For example, you tend to get more older people and more women on phone surveys. So I have weighted the data to reflect that and to correct for it. Okay, so then I have my data. I have over 900 phone survey responses, and I want to start seeing if people do fall into these categories. So how am I going to take my data, the questions that I asked, and categorize people? Quick overview, the first part of doing that was level of comfort, because that is at the core of this four types, the definition. And so we had a series of questions on the survey about comfort level riding a bicycle in different types of environments. So that was my first step. The second part was that interest, and in particular there's that interested but concerned category where it's not just comfort level, but it's by definition interest level in bicycling. So that was the second part, and then I had to adjust a little bit for actual cycling behavior, and I'll explain that in a moment. So what did we do? That first part, the level of comfort. So we had a series of questions that were prefaced with, I'm going to read a list of places you could ride a bike. For each place, please tell me how comfortable you would feel biking there using a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being very uncomfortable, 4 being very comfortable. These are hypothetical scenarios. We started out with a path or trail separate from the street, and then we sort of worked our way up different scenarios, and they were generic. We didn't say such as, Barber Boulevard or something like that. They were tried over the phone to describe. So we gave characteristics about the number of lanes on the street, the speed of the traffic if there was parking, and then what type of bike facility might be on it. So we start out with a path or a trail separate from the street. Then we included, when we got into more on-street facilities, we had 3 different types of on-street scenarios. First one, a 2-lane neighborhood commercial shopping street, 25 to 30 miles an hour, on-street parking, no bike lane. Then we said, what if a striped bike lane was added? Then we sort of stepped it up a notch, a larger street, 4 lanes, higher speed traffic, no bike lane. Then what if a bike lane was added? And then we stepped it up even more in sort of a really more suburban environment. We have a center divider, higher traffic speeds, 35 to 40 miles an hour, still no bike lane, and we add a striped bike lane.
Sorry, Jennifer, just to interrupt. They are having a hard time hearing you on the web. And can you move back?
I'm sorry. Or maybe my hair was in the way. Sorry about that on the web. Thank you for being on the web. Okay. And so we have basically, you see here, I have 3 scenarios, and each one is with and without a bike lane. And so for each of those, each person said on a scale of 1 to 4, how comfortable would I feel riding a bike on that facility? So these actually 6 questions were the first things I used to categorize the cyclists. So what did I do? So starting at the top of this table, for the scenarios without bike lanes, so those 3 scenarios without the bike lanes, if someone so I averaged their scores, and if they had a 3.5 or higher, I felt that they feel very comfortable on non-residential streets without bike lanes. So that would mean they would have to, score it a 4, 4, and a 3, or a 4, 4, 4, and 4 being very comfortable. So I felt in all 3 of those scenarios, if they said I'm very comfortable on at least 2 of them and somewhat comfortable on another one, they're strong. Potentially they are strong and fearless. Then the next grouping is if I took the 3 where we had added the bike lane. And so if people were very comfortable on average on those facilities, I thought, okay, I'm going to put them into the enthused and confident. So basically they've told me they feel very comfortable in most circumstances if there's a bike lane. So they were put into potentially the enthused and confident category. Then there's the folks who didn't score that high on the scenarios with bike lanes, so less than a 3.5. So for now, I've categorized those as not very comfortable on streets with bike lanes. And those, that's the concerned part of the interested but concerned. They're not comfortable about the facilities. They're concerned about their safety, etc. I don't know yet if they're interested, though. Then there's the sort of the no way, no hows at the other end. And there's 2 ways people were put into this category. First of all, we had a screening question. Are you physically able to ride a bicycle? And so people who said, no, I'm not physically able, or I don't know, were put into the no way, no how category. And then I used that first question about the paths and trails. So if someone said, I am very uncomfortable riding a bike on a path or a trail separate from the street, I put them into the no way, no how category. I sort of felt if you don't feel comfortable in that situation, then I'm not sure if you're going to feel comfortable in any type of situation. So granted, it's clear, I made some decisions here. And we can talk later about how that might influence the findings. So that was the first part. So then the second part gets at the interest issue. So we had a question on there that says, please tell me how strongly you disagree, agree, etc., with a bunch of different statements, and one of them was, I would like to travel by bike more than I do now. So people could either agree or disagree with that, and if they agreed, I thought they're interested in cycling. So combining those two things, this is what ended up happening. So the strong and the fearless are very comfortable without bike lanes, and it didn't matter what their interest level was. They're in that category. The same thing with the enthused and confident. If people felt very comfortable riding in a bike lane on a non-residential street, they stayed in the enthused and confident category. Then we get to the folks who didn't feel very comfortable with streets with bike lanes. If they were interested in cycling more, I left them in the interested but concerned category. If they were not interested, but they had cycled for transportation in the past 30 days, I left them in the interested but concerned. So technically, they're not interested in cycling more, but they're currently cycling to some extent. And I would imagine when you start to think about that, that makes sense. There's some people who may be cycling once a week, and that's fine. That's the perfect amount for them. They don't need to do it anymore. Or they're cycling 7 days a week, and that's the perfect amount. But they're still not very comfortable, even with the bike lanes. So that was the adjustment based on actual behavior. And then if people felt not comfortable and they're not interested and they hadn't cycled, put them in the no way, no how category, along with the other folks that I've already explained. So that's how I used basically sort of 3 pieces of information to put people into one of these 4 categories. And just as an FYI, these folks, the ones who were not interested but are cycling to some extent, it was a small number that fell into that category. So how does it turn out? I put everyone into the categories, and then I run my numbers, and I see, okay, what share of the population falls into each of these groups? These are the numbers for the sample within the city of Portland, for the rest of the region, and the entire region. And so I'll focus on the overall numbers. 4% ended up in the strong and fearless category, 9% in the enthused and confident, 56% in the interested but concerned, and 31% in the no way, no how. And you can see slight differences between the city of Portland and the rest of the region. The city has more folks who are strong and fearless and more in the interested but concerned. The rest of the region has more folks in the no way, no how category. And that may be a reflection of the investment the city of Portland has made into creating, in some parts of the city, a more bicycle-friendly environment. And just to remind you, if we look at the city of Portland's, the distribution that I determined, comparing that to Roger's estimate, he put less than 1% in the strong and fearless, 7% in enthused and confident, 60% in interested but concerned, and 33% in the no way, no how. So surprisingly, pretty darn close. And just to be clear, I wasn't testing the distribution as I was coming up with my definition. It was like I came up with my definition, I ran the numbers, and it's like, oh, wow, it's pretty darn close to Roger's estimate. So I have people in these 4 categories. I want to learn a little bit more about them. And so one of the first things I wanted to learn is what are they doing now in terms of bicycling? Because I want to make it clear that their current bicycling behavior only had a very, very small influence in how people were categorized, because the categories were really supposed to cover the whole population, not just current cyclists. So we had a number of questions on the survey about current cycling behavior. We asked, in the past month, how many days did you ride a bike? And then we tried to get numbers for riding a bike to work or school or errands, shopping, those types of things. What as transportation planners we call utilitarian travel. So it's travel that you're doing to get someplace to do something. the reason most people are driving their car is utilitarian travel, as opposed to what I would call recreational travel, which is just going out for a bike ride, mountain biking, going on a trail, making a loop, etc. I want to be clear, when I talk about sort of recreational bicycling, I really am referring to that. I'm not, if someone rides their bike to go to the gym, rides their bike to go to the movies, to meet friends and play a game, that is still utilitarian travel. They're traveling, they're riding their bike to get somewhere to do something that the majority of Americans drive their car to do that instead. So. Then we had a couple questions about in a typical summer month, how many days do you ride for transportation in a typical winter month? So I used these to, again, categorize people to simplify things. And what I did is I categorized people, first of all, as a non-cyclist. Either they said, I haven't ridden my bike in the past 30 days, or there was a screening question early on that said, I never ride a bicycle. So if they said, I never ride a bicycle, they were able to skip a lot of questions. Those are non-cyclists. The utilitarian cyclists, if they had at least once in the past 30 days, and remember I did this in summertime, so it was nice weather time. So in that, if in the past 30 days they'd ridden once to work, school, shopping, whatever, and once a month in a typical summer or a typical winter. So there had to be some pattern of typical behavior, but pretty low bar, once a month. And then basically everyone else sort of ended up being categorized as a recreational cyclist. They had cycled once in the past, at least once in the past 30 days, and they didn't meet that threshold for utilitarian travel. So think of people that way, because I do, in some previous research, I really found that there's people who bike for transportation to get places, and there's people who bike for recreation, and often those don't, they're not the same people. Sometimes they are, but then I'm sure we all know people who go out mountain biking, or they do cyclocross, or they just go out on long, 100-mile rides, but they never ride to work or anything else. So how do these four types of cyclists, what are they currently doing? And it's a wide range. It's not maybe what you might expect. So the strong and the fearless, if we look, the distribution is actually remarkably similar between these groups. The strong and the fearless, 42% are utilitarian. I put 36% of them in the non-cyclist category. Enthused and confident, you can see the distribution. Again, almost half of them are currently utilitarian, almost a third currently recreation, and some non-cyclist. Interested but concerned, similar distribution. The no way, no hows, there's a few recreational cyclists in there, but for the most part, they're either a non-cyclist or they're unable to ride a bicycle, or they don't know how. Now you might stop thinking, wait a minute, strong and fearless, they're not cycling? That doesn't make sense. But when you think back to how we categorize people, it did start making sense to me. I'm sure there are people, if you ask them, do you feel comfortable riding a bike on the street without a bike lane? Oh yeah, I do, but they don't cycle. It may have been their previous experience when they were in college. They were, they felt perfectly comfortable, or for whatever reason, they feel comfortable, but they don't necessarily engage in that behavior. So another way to present this, and sort of using Rogers, puts his types out on a sort of a bar across the spectrum. So this is something similar to give sort of an idea. And again, the biggest chunk of the population falls into this interested but concerned. A lot of them are non-cyclists or recreational cyclists. Looking at it a little different way to get, because the amount of cycling, my bar for classifying someone as a utilitarian cyclist was pretty low. These are not necessarily people who are cycling every day. So this is where you start to see some more differences. For example, in a typical summer month, the interested but concerned utilitarian cyclists, 46% of them are doing it 0 to 9 days, so somewhat. 24% of them, for example, are doing it 20 to 31 days. So that's pretty regularly, several times a week. As opposed, whoops, there's a mistake on my labeling that I have not caught, even though I've done this before. This should say recreational cyclists in this middle one. Oh, they all, oh, wait. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Back up. So, I'm sorry. So these are all people who are doing these are all the utilitarian cyclists. So the interested but concerned, this is their pattern, and this is the enthused and confident. And this is what I want you to focus on, the comparison. So the interested but concerned, people who are utilitarian cyclists, only 24% of them are doing it on a regular basis, as opposed to the enthused and confident, where 43% of them are doing it on a pretty regularly basis, at least in a typical summer month or a typical winter month. So even though the distribution of sort of non-cyclist utilitarian recreation was sort of the same between all these categories, the amount that they're actually riding does differ significantly. So the enthused and confident are the ones who are cycling the most. Those strong and fearless aren't cycling very much either. I want to caution to not pay a whole lot of attention to them in this analysis. It's a pretty small number, and it's, I think, a somewhat unusual group. Typical winter month, again, cycling rates go down, but they're still higher for the enthused and confident cyclists. Looking at some demographics, so overall, especially after I weighted the sample, 51% of my sample weighted were women. And then what this graph is showing is the share within each group that are women. So you want to compare that to 51%. And so in general, women are underrepresented, definitely amongst the strong and the fearless and the enthused and confident. And they're more likely to be overrepresented in the no way, no how, and the interested but concerned. And then within each category, women are more likely to be non-cyclists than cyclists. So they may be enthused and confident, but 47% of the non-enthused and confident non-cyclists are women. So of the people who are enthused and confident who are cycling, only 20% or so of them are women compared to 51% of the population. Same thing with the interested but concerned. The women are more likely to be the non-cyclists than the cyclists within that category. And then they're much more likely to be non-cyclists, the no way, no hows. Age, we see a distribution. Strong and fearless tend to be young, 18 to 34. Our enthused and confident tend to be, at least the ones who are cycling, tend to be more middle-aged, 35 to 54. The interested but concerned, again, the ones who are cycling tend to be younger. The ones who are not cycling tend to be older. And the no way, no hows definitely tend to be older, particularly the ones who are unable to ride a bicycle. So are much more likely to be 55 or older. But there is some range there as well. And then another thing I looked at was their experience as a child. So we had a question about, as a kid, how often did you ride a bike to school? Because one theory is that their experience as a kid may be influencing what's going on now as an adult. And if you focus in on the blue bars, which is never, I never rode a bike as a kid to school, the no way, no how are much more likely to have never ridden a bike to school as a kid. And the interested but concerned were also more likely to not have ridden to school as opposed to the enthused and confident. About a third or more than a third said never. They were much more likely to say, I frequently rode a bike to school. So there may be an influence. Next, I want to sort of transition. There's a lot of data in the survey, and there's a lot of ways to slice it and dice it, as you've already seen. What I'm going to do now is just focus a little bit more on the interested but concerned group, and that's partly because that's what the city of Portland has focused on. It is the largest chunk of the population. And so we had a number of questions about people's attitudes, perceptions, etc. And so if we just look at the interested but concerned, and again, the non-cyclist, recreational, utilitarian. The reason I'm focusing on this is that in theory, it's these non-cyclists that you want to move into being utilitarian cyclists, or the recreation cyclists, you want to get them to start biking for transportation. So what's the difference? They all have sort of the same level of comfort and interest, but part of this group is not cycling for transportation and part is, and so that's why I think it's useful to look at those differences. And some of it gets at the built environment. So the people who are currently cycling are much more likely to say that there's bike lanes nearby, that there's some quiet streets nearby that are nice to bike on. They're less likely to say that there's too much traffic on streets nearby. They're less likely to say, or they're more likely to say that the traffic is slow, and also issues of speed. So definitely the physical environment seems to be one reason this group is either cycling or not cycling. There's also some social factors, because we talk about sort of social norms and support. Do you have social support for cycling? And definitely the utilitarian cyclists who are in this group of interested but concerned, they're more likely to say, you know, my family and friends think I should bike more, they would support me, or that they think I should bike more, that people around them bike a lot, that their coworkers bike. So they seem to have more social support around bicycling. They see more people bicycling on the street that look like them. And I know I have a lot of data here. I may be going through it relatively quickly. This is all available online in a working paper that you can get, so if you want to follow up on any of these numbers. And then some sort of personal factors and attitudes towards bicycling and other modes of transportation. And anything here that's in bold, there's a significant difference between this group and the utilitarian cyclists. So the utilitarian cyclists, you know, they feel an obligation to bicycle rather than driving. It's easier for them. They know where it's safe to do this. They live in places where they feel that there's destinations nearby within a bicycling distance. They're less likely to say that I don't have time. One thing I want to point out here is this next one I was getting to, which is I don't like wearing a helmet, because there's a lot of speculation that wearing a helmet might be prohibiting people from cycling more. I did not find any differences with respect to that between these groups. So that would indicate that perhaps it's not a barrier to why they're not cycling. Some of the other differences: secure bike parking, feeling comfortable biking when it's raining or after dark. So those are some of the other differences. And then what about different facilities? I already went through the questions that we used to determine comfort level. On a couple of those, we added, after we said, what about a striped bike lane? Then we said, what if it also had a wide bike lane separated from traffic by a raised curb or parked cars? This is what a lot of people refer to as a cycle track. It's similar to what we have over on Southwest Broadway, just a couple blocks from here. But there's more physical separation than just a white stripe on the pavement. So if we look at that, this is where you start to see some potentially big differences. What I want to focus on is what I've sort of circled here. Again, the interested but concerned. This is their level of comfort. So this is the percent who feel comfortable in these different facilities. And so by definition, they're not feeling comfortable if there's no bike facility. That's by definition. They're not feeling very comfortable with just a bike lane. But when you add that physically separated lane, this is where you see a big bump. So 43% of the interested but concerned said, I would feel very comfortable in that type of facility, as opposed to only 2% of them feeling very comfortable with just a striped bike lane. That's a huge difference in at least stated level of comfort. And I do want to emphasize these are, stated level of comfort. It's not their actual behavior, which could be different. Looking at all the different facilities, just to give you the range of the interested but concerned. We started people out on a path or a trail, and on average, the interested but concerned felt, gave a score of 3.7 on a scale of 4 in terms of comfort level. They also feel sort of equally comfortable. These two bars are quiet residential streets and also with sort of traffic calming. So they feel very comfortable in all of those types of scenarios. And then the rest here is sort of the non-residential on-street. And in each case, for example, this is, no bike lane. We add a bike lane. We add the cycle track, the physically separated. And level of comfort goes up. And in this case, on this type of a street, you're up to a level of comfort averaging 3.2, which is pretty high, particularly if you sort of use this as the standard. If you don't feel comfortable on a path or a trail, you're not going to feel comfortable anywhere. And so we're almost getting up to that comfort level with that physically separated facility. So I want to just quickly, because I do want to leave time for questions, I started more recently sort of taking a different approach and said, okay, well, what if we don't use these 4 types? If I were doing a market analysis, how might I approach it? So one thing I've been playing with lately is, what if I just divided people up based on their interest level and their current behavior? And so if I put people in 3 categories of people who I've called high transportation cyclists. So those are people who cycle at least 3 days a month for transportation in a typical summer month. So again, a fairly low bar for high, but it's some regular cycling for transportation. Then I have folks who don't cycle, 0 to 2 days a month, but they're interested in cycling more. And then the people who are not interested and they currently aren't doing anything, but they're physically able. So it's the second group that might be your target market. Okay, they're not doing it now, but they're interested in doing it more. So how do those people differ, for example, from the people who are doing it now? So when I look at it this way, just about 30% fall into the high, 46% into that potentially target market, and then the 24% into not interested. I want to remind you, I've taken out the part of the sample who are physically unable to ride. So this is a smaller portion of the overall sample. And again, similar to the 4 types categorization, women are either not interested or they're more likely to not be doing, they may be interested but not doing it now compared to doing it now. And again, there's an age distribution that tends to be, the younger to middle age is more likely to be doing it now, and then older adults are either interested or they're not interested. Again, sort of doing a market type analysis, looking at a lot of the attitudinal questions, because if you're thinking about how am I going to market, how might I market bicycling to these groups and try to get people to bike more. These are the questions where there really was no difference between the cyclists and the interested, but non-cyclists. And so things like a lot of the things to do with the environment, pollution is a major problem. Vehicles should be taxed based on the amount of pollution they produce. things like that, there really wasn't a difference. They agree, they equally agree. So they have maybe similar environmental ethics and concerns, but that's not what's sort of driving the difference between whether they cycle or they not cycle, or some other things about sort of travel in general, or the desired, they equally say it's important for me to get physical exercise. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be determining whether or not they cycle or they don't. Where I am seeing some differences are on some of these other attitudes that I get at issues of people's time and also perhaps the physical environment and their ability to engage in this behavior, to bicycle. So things like, biking can sometimes be easier for me, so that's a big difference. The folks who cycle are more likely to agree with that. It's easier for them. And okay, so then the next question is, why is it easier? And so that's, I don't have a direct answer for that. I think that would sort of be the next step in figuring out, why is it easier? Is it easier because we have facilities, that they live in a place where things are nearby? Is it easier because of their lifestyle? They prefer to bike. They're a bit more likely to like riding a bike, but overall both these groups like riding a bike. The folks who aren't doing it are more likely to say, I need a car to do many of the things I like to do. They're also more likely to say that traveling by car is safer than riding a bike. So those are the things. And then they do, the transportation cyclists are more likely to say, I try to limit my driving to reduce pollution. So it's a little bit of mixed messages sort of on the environment as a motivation for getting people to bike or not. And that's consistent with a lot of other research out there, that may not be sort of a prime motivator for people. So before I open it up to some questions, which I'm looking forward to, as a researcher, I have to sort of have my acknowledge some of the limitations. There's more, but some of the ones to highlight. This is a phone survey. There's limitations to phone surveys. We've tried to do our best to get a good sample by using a mobile sample as well as landlines, weighting the data, etc. But there's still limitations of sampling. You're still going to miss certain groups of people. And also there's some things over a phone that are difficult to ask. I mean, we were sort of asking very visual things on the phone. This is a survey that was done for the Portland region. So whether or not these same distribution would apply to other regions or whether the demographics of the groups look the same, I can't tell you until we survey in some other places. This isn't so much a limitation, but just one of many questions for future research is, how does comfort level change with experience? So in other words, if you're currently uncomfortable, but you start bicycling, in other words, would you move from interested but concerned to enthused and confident? And does that change with your behavior? But then at the same time, how does age play a factor in that? So for example, personally I know that when I was in college and grad school and under 30, I rode my bike in some pretty unsafe places. I don't know if I was quite strong and fearless, but I was awfully close to that. Now I look back and I say that was absolutely ridiculous. I would never do that now. And so even though my experience, I may be biking a lot more, or I've had more experience of actually bicycling on the road. On the other hand, as I've gotten older, I may have become more risk averse. And so those two things, how do those factors play into folks on sort of their life course? So next steps, more analysis of the data. Some of this, the last things I showed you is really new. I've just been exploring that further. Perhaps adopting some other typology from scratch is, and then I welcome your ideas and we'll open it up. That is my faculty website, and I do have a link there to a working paper that presented All of these results, except for those last couple slides, and we can post the PowerPoint as well, but if you really wanted to dig into it more, that working paper has a lot of information. So with that, I'm going to open it up. I want to remind people, because we are webcasting, that we want you to use the microphone so people on the web can hear your question.
Other demographic information besides gender and age?
I do. I have race and ethnicity and income and education.
Great.
Off the top of my head, I don't remember if I saw many differences there. And unfortunate, even with a sample of 900, some of those demographic groups, it gets a little hard to start slicing and dicing the data too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm interested in seeing how this would crosswalk with the consumer spending demographics.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you. Did you find some gender differences regarding the social perceptions, like the social support and
Off the top of my head, I do not remember. I have dug into some of the gender differences more. I'll try to get back. I'm sorry I don't remember that offhand. There were some differences even in the statement, I like riding a bike. That's not directly. I'm just trying to remember where I did find some gender differences in those attitudes. Women were less likely to say, I like riding a bike. They were, yeah, I don't remember. I should just stop right there before I speculate.
So I noticed in the table when you were sorting people into, it was pretty early on, but people who had responded that they would like to ride a bike more, and a portion of those got sorted into the no way, no how category. Could you explain a little bit more about why you decided to put them there?
Well, this was my logic. Was that the definition, my reading of Roger's way he categorized people, it was largely based on comfort level. That's sort of the primary way to put people. And so that was my primary, and interest level was sort of a secondary thing. Now, and so that's why, so you're saying this group, the not inter?
The one before that where it says where they're not comfortable on paths or trails, but it answered either.
Oh,
if they answered yes,
yeah,
okay,
yeah. So so they're not comfortable biking on a trail, but for some reason they said I'm interested in bicycling more. I chose to use the comfort as the determining factor. Now, and offhand, I can't remember how many people were not comfortable but interested in cycling more. And if it's a big enough group, perhaps I should look at them a little bit more. But I based my decisions largely on their comfort level. And again, it's a decision that I, as a researcher, made. I could make some different decisions, and my numbers, my distribution would probably be a little different. Yeah. Oh, microphone.
Are you planning, or have you looked at this data in relation to the Oregon Household Activity Survey? It might be interesting if you have, if you know where these people live, how their attitudes and responses line up with, the household survey results.
That's definitely a next step that we haven't started doing. And I do know where these people live. The vast majority of them, I know where they live. So I know their perception of the physical environment. We also know, well, where do they live? So what is the environment around them? And we can start linking that as well. It's a wealth of data. But yeah, I think, and yes.
So you started the validation, I guess the validation is mostly based on comfort in different physical environments, which I think makes sense in this context. But do you think that there might be more of an underlying categorization independent of the physical context that could then help you make conclusions about the influence of the physical context? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, and that would sort of be my next, and that was what I was starting to play with at the end, and want to do more. So if people have ideas, sort of like ignore the 4 types. If we just started from scratch and said, how would I categorize cyclists? Or not, how would I categorize people with respect to cycling? What would I start with? And so, one thing to start with was the thing I did at the end, which is just interest in their current behavior. So if people have ideas for sort of, if you were starting from scratch, how would you do it? Please share, and hopefully we can do it.
Early on, you said that, I believe, late in the presentation, you were saying that you're interested in how people's experience later affects their cycling. You were relating it to your own experience of cycling in dangerous places when you were young, and less so now. But earlier in a slide, you had, I believe, younger frequent cyclists were a large portion of interested but concerned. And so I thought, is there some relationship to they're relatively dependent on the mode, they are concerned for their well-being, but or if you explore that at all.
Are you referring to like this?
The 47%, yeah.
So the interested but concerned who are currently utilitarian, 47% are in the 18. I'll be honest, I hadn't thought about that a whole lot yet. They're definitely overrepresented there compared to the population, as opposed to the enthused and confident really are this middle-aged group. I'll have to look at that more. Thank you for highlighting that. And there's one over there after.
So you talked about attitudes of social support and the built environment. Did you at all ask questions about maybe how they felt about the bike they owned? Maybe that they only owned an old Huffy that they bought at Sears forever ago?
That's, we did not ask anything. We did ask if they have, well, no, did we? We didn't, no, we didn't even screen based on bike. We screened based on whether, like, I never ride a bicycle. That screened people. I think it's a good topic for research, is sort of the bike itself and how that might be influencing their behavior. We do have, I've done some research on electric assist bikes and whether that might be a good technology for some of this interested but concerned group in certain demographics. And we have a research project going on right now. John MacArthur is leading, where we're going to loan electric assist bikes to people and test that out, if the technology itself might help overcome some of these barriers. Or, cargo bikes and things like that, does it help overcome it would be easy for me to ride my bike for everyday, transportation. So it's an area there's been very little research on.
I have a statement and then a question. With the question about children, whether they biked as a child, I couldn't bike to school, but I biked a lot, so that's maybe rephrasing that question might be better.
I did ask 2, actually.
Okay.
I had a second question. I had the did you bike to school, and then I had did you bike for other places. So I actually did sort of cover. I just decided to only show the school results, but I do have a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my question was, did you see within the women's proportions, did you see age changes, especially with this younger generation of women compared to older generations of women? And that might be an interesting survey.
I have not looked at that. I will look at that. I'm a little worried. Again, it gets at that issue when you start slicing and dicing too much, you end up with pretty small categories, and so I have to be careful. But I'll look at that and see how things might differ.
And presence of children in the household, does that change people's risk assessment?
Yes. And we do have that information. There's a lot. It's fun, but it's overwhelming at times.
Other questions?
Well, I think another thing that might be interesting to find out is how long people have lived here, and are they moving here specifically because they perceive the region as a bike-friendly place to live, and does that impact the neighborhoods they choose to live in? I think, there's a lot of research that would be useful in a number of ways that you could dig out of that.
Yes. We did not ask how long people have lived here. We did ask how important, I'm pretty sure we asked how important the bicycling environment was in choosing their current home. I think we asked that. The reason I'm hesitating is because I have survey data from two different research projects that a lot of the questions are the same, and so I start to worry that which one did we ask that on? But I agree that is a thing worth exploring for sure. Yeah, there's a lot from this survey I can look at separate from sort of the types of cyclists type thing. Yeah.
Time for one more question. Anybody? Takers?
Were there any differences between the social support regionally, if you looked at it urban, suburban, sort of?
I have not looked at that yet.
Okay.
I mean, part of the nice thing about doing a seminar like this is that you guys give me some good ideas, and particularly, what are the questions that you as a practitioner in the region want to know? And so that last analysis I did, it was largely in response to some conversations I had with the city of Portland and the staff there and sort of their take on it. So that's one thing I definitely want to do is what can I glean from this that's going to be useful in projects and programs, etc. So thank you.
Great. Well, let's thank Dr. Dill for a great presentation. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Lisa Altman Hall from the University of Vermont talking about livability. So we'll see you then.